KIL is an oven for baking clay. You'll notice that I'm saying KIL and not KILN because that's the original pronunciation. A lot of people don't know that, and most people say it wrong, but you could Google it if you're not sure. In this example here, you can see that there are lightweight bricks, and they surround the outside with steel around that, and the inside you can see small heating elements that are turned on when the KIL is turned on. This is a very common model. We have a couple just like this, but they have KILs that are very, very small, like the size of like a shoebox, and then they have some as big as a room. A stilt. Now we use stilts sometimes we don't use stilts. Stilts is when you want to have glaze on the bottom of your sculpture or your pottery, but obviously if you put glaze on the bottom and you put it in the KIL, it's going to heat it to a high temperature. It's going to fuse it to the KIL, because remember, glaze fuses to whatever it touches. So what we do is we put a stilt under there with these little metal prongs, and that holds it up off the KIL floor or the KIL shelf. Now it may put a little bitty mark in there where the little prong is, but usually it's on the bottom and you can't see it anyway. So we use these quite often. Sometimes we have a dry foot and we don't need these, but there are lots of times when I want to use the stilts. Now a cone, we used to use the cones a lot. Basically, these are small pieces of clay that melt at specific temperatures. And I used to put them in the KIL, and when they would melt, it would shut off the KIL. And that's how we did it. Now we have electronic KILs that we don't need cones anymore. But the reason I'm including this is because a lot of glazes still refer to cones. They might say this glaze is meant for cone 5. And so a lot of people don't know what it is because cones aren't used like they used to be used. But it's important when you're glazing things that you know what cone it is, because you have to heat your KIL to the right temperature for the glaze. So when you program the KIL, you type in the cone. Okay, when you look at the glaze on the bottle, you also see what cone they use. Plaster bat. A plaster bat is a piece of plaster, a big slab of plaster that we use sometimes to put slip-on to dry it out. Now this is back in the day when we used to reclaim all of our stuff by hand. Like I said before, now we're using the pug mill, and the pug mill, you just put the clay in there and it goes through the whole process. But we used to have to mix it all up into slip and put it on these big bats, and it would suck the moisture right out of the clay, and after a day or so we'd come back and wedge it up and use it. We don't do this anymore, but if you didn't have a pug mill at home, a piece of plaster would come in handy. Now anytime we want to make a slab, a flat piece of clay, we might use a rolling pin or a rollers. When I was at Illinois State University, we had huge rollers, kind of like the one shown here, where you could put your clay down and you would just roll the big wheel over. It would make the clay perfectly flat and the same thickness all the way through. Now we use like a piece of pipe or a rolling pin, or a lot of things will do to roll it out. So we call these rollers. A wedging wire is used to cut clay. It's just a wire with a couple pieces of dowel rod on the end, and you use it to cut clay. Now we cut clay for a lot of reasons. Generally, it's called a wedging wire is because you would wedge and then you would cut it to see if it's mixed up properly and there's no air bubbles. But now we just use it to cut off clay because it's an easy way to cut off clay. A canvas. A lot of times in class we will use canvases because anytime you want to roll out clay and make a slab, if you were to do that on the table, all the clay would stick and you wouldn't be able to peel it off. And some students make this mistake. you need a piece of canvas or some kind of material down so that you can peel the canvas away from the clay after you roll it out. Now this example here is really kind of a cool setup because it's got a plaster bat on the right, a piece of canvas on the left, and a wedging wire. So it's like a whole station where you could wedge, and you could draw out the clay, and you can cut the clay. And so it's kind of cool. It's a nice little setup. Realistic. When we talk about clay, our projects being realistic or realism, we're talking about them being extremely real looking. And if you see this example here, this painting is absolutely amazing. It looks as real as it can look, okay? So when we talk about realism, we're talking about something that looks like the real thing. When we talk about abstraction, generally we mean that abstraction would be something that is altered, it's changed, it's exaggerated, and it's abstracted. And that's what we're talking about when we talk about abstraction. Functional. If we say something is functional, it means that it has a useful purpose. Sometimes we could say you have something that is broken, so it's not functional for its original intended purpose. But if, like a piece of pottery, obviously is functional as maybe a bowl or a cup, and that's its function. We talk about decorative. We talk about something that is designed for looks. It's ornamental. Okay, we talk about like decorating the tree or putting ornaments on there to make it look good. So it's designed for looks. Craftsmanship is very important in art, and I really believe that everyone should work hard at being a good craftsman. And that means that you take the time and the care and you have the skill to make something well. And you do a good job. For example, when we're working on our pottery, if it's supposed to be smooth, you take the time to fettle it, to burnish it, to make it smooth, and to make it, a well-made piece of artwork. And that's craftsmanship. Someone with poor craftsmanship maybe doesn't take that time to do a good job and to do it the way it should be done. Generally, when I think of a craftsman, I think of an old guy making something, and that's not really very true, but that's just the impression I get when I think about it. Someone that really has a lot of experience, has a lot of patience, takes the time and does a good job. Representational or non-representational is what I mean, or non-objective. It means that you create something that looks abstract. It didn't really originate from something real. It's just it doesn't represent anything. So if it is not really supposed to be anything, it's just a piece of art. When I talk about organic, I'm talking about something that looks like it came from nature. Generally, I talk about free-flowing, free forms and things like that. But if it looks like it's natural, we call it organic. So here's a couple examples here. It could be called organic, just kind of a natural flowing form. And that's what we're referring to. When we talk about proportional, we talk about when one thing is related to another in size, degree, or amount. Okay? And you look at these right here and you can say, are these proportional? I would say that they are not proportional, because I feel like the smallest little salsa is not, if you made it bigger, it would be too narrow. Also, when you look at like a sculpture, let's assume that someone made a sculpture and they made the arms so that the fingers touch the ground. We'd say that's not in proportion to a regular human being, because I know the arm should only go to about, past their waist, where their pockets are. That's where their arms and fingers should stop. So that wouldn't be proportional. Unity. Unity is when everything is tied together in some way, when it all works together as one. And there's lots of ways to create unity. and in this case here they're using the same shapes and similar colors, and they're repeating, okay, and that's a way to create unity. Contrast is when one thing is very different than another. They contrast. White and black can contrast. Color and black and white can contrast, or light colors and dark colors. One example sometimes I see this is when we're making t-shirts in class, and the kids say, I have a white t-shirt and I want to put yellow ink on it. And then I say, well, that's not going to contrast because yellow and white are so, close. From a distance, you're not going to be able to tell what it is because there's no contrast. Or if they want to say, I want to put purple on black, and I'm like, it just is a contrast. I wouldn't suggest it. So that's a contrast. But remember, contrast could be between rough and smooth. That could be a contrast. Or big and small. There's lots of ways to contrast. Negative and positive. Generally talk about negative, positive shapes or space. I kind of use those interchangeably. I think it's more simple that way. So generally I say the object is the positive thing, and the space around it, the air around it, the shape around it is the negative thing. Okay? And I put some examples here where you would say the little deer is the positive thing and all the space, the white around it, is negative. But when you get to this other example of either the faces or the cup, you're like, okay, which one's which? So it's kind of a trick thing. When we talk about form, we're talking about something that looks three-dimensional and not flat. Okay? We say shapes look flat. Forms are three-dimensional. So, for example, here you can see this artwork here. The line drawing we could consider shape, where the arms come out and he has the cuffs, and then what he's done, and by the way, this is M.C. Escher, he shaded it, he's used shadows, so it looks like it's three-dimensional, and we call that form. Asymmetrical versus symmetrical. Okay, both of these have a balance to them, so it's symmetrical balance or asymmetrical balance, but symmetrical means that basically both sides look the same. A face is a good example of this. If you draw a line straight down your face, they basically look the same. Asymmetrical means they both have similar balance, but one is different. Additive. Additive means to create a sculpture or any type of artwork by adding materials. So subtractive would be if you were going to take away materials. If you're going to carve into something, that would be a subtractive technique. An armature is like the skeleton. It's the framework for the artwork. And in some of my projects, we will create an armature. We will build our sculpture on an armature. Sometimes we will create like an exoskeleton, which really isn't an armature because the structure is on the outside. Okay, and the armature, the structure is kind of on the inside, is the skeleton. When we talk about holes in art, we're talking about, it could be a hole, an actual hole, or it could be a void or a big impression. Could be a hole. So, for example, here, this sculpture here would be, would have several holes. And you can see that it has a hole in the middle, but under the bottom of it, you can see there's a void there, and that could be considered a hole, and a big indented part can be considered a hole. So not just an actual hole, but other areas also where there's no material, there's no mass. Mass is always a tough one. They always get mass and weight kind of mixed up, but mass, I think, is the amount of matter in an object. For example, you could have something that's really big and be super light, like styrofoam, and it has a big mass because it takes a big amount of matter, it takes a big amount of space, okay, but it may not be heavy. So don't get those confused. The mass and the weight are kind of different. Scale. When we talk about scale in art, we're talking about kind of like the size of the object. Have you ever heard of something saying that's a large scale artwork? Well, they kind of talk about the size of the object, or it's a small scale, where it's much smaller than, maybe the original. So that's what we talk when we talk about scale. That's what we mean in my class. Freestanding versus base. Freestanding means that you have an artwork that stands on its own. It doesn't need anything to hold it up. Okay, but some sculptures or projects, we may need some kind of bottom on it to hold it, and that's what we call a base. So a base holds it up, and freestanding is it stands up on its own. Okay, that's the end of our ceramics vocabulary. You're going to do not assignment 1B, it's going to be assignment 1C, I believe, but I will have to check on that. We'll check Google Classroom because I have all the information there. That's all for today. Have a good day.